Hi, Founder fans. Jason here, and today's founder is Nicholas Lowe, who was a bookkeeper for a very important American founder. But every conversation with Nicholas Lowe actually has to start with his older brother, Isaac. You see, the Lowe brothers came from one of the wealthiest families in New Jersey, and both had success as merchants in New York City during the colonial era. But his brother, Isaac, ends up being a real important leader going into the pre-revolutionary era. In fact, Isaac ends up being the chairman of the Committee of 51, which was the initial organization that took over after the royal governor dissolved the colonial assembly. And Nicholas's brother Isaac ends up going to the First Continental Congress representing New York. A really important person who does not like the idea of the Declaration of Independence, and despite his credentials, ends up becoming a loyalist. Now, Nicholas stays out of the fray. He was a wealthy merchant, and what Britain was doing with taxes was not very good for his business, but he was letting his brother do all the politicking. Unfortunately, once Isaac goes loyalist, Nicholas, who had been out of the fray this whole time, remains out of the fray because he doesn't want to get caught up in it. This seems to be a wise move, because once the Revolutionary War ends and the British evacuate, Nicholas Lowe remains in New York City. Now, as we discussed yesterday with Dr. Richard Bailey, many people who had questionable ties in New York City still got to stick around because New York City was evacuated and needed people living there to do things. Nicholas Lowe is one of these people, and he ends up clearing his family name. First of all, by 1788, when the Constitution is presented, Nicholas Lowe attends the ratification convention for New York State to ratify the U.S. Constitution, and he does support the Constitution. As you know, it was very much going to help merchants, especially ones in New York City, and Lowe was happy to take advantage of that. Now, more importantly, Lowe actually ends up keeping the books for his friend Rufus King. Rufus King is a name you might know. He was an extraordinarily important founder. He's an inaugural member of the United States Senate from New York State. And then he goes on to represent George Washington as the minister to Great Britain. And while Rufus King is overseas, Nicholas Lowe keeps his books and keeps his businesses alive while his friend is doing all of these very important things, creating the United States of America as we know it today. Now, Nicholas Lowe during this time actually also runs for New York State Assembly, and New York State Assembly, and participates in the assembly for 2 years. Unfortunately, Nicholas doesn't really fancy himself a politician and goes back to private life. He gets into land development. Now, in the early years of America after the Constitution, many founders tried to make a fortune by speculating or purchasing land. Lots and lots of land. And they wanted to resell this to other people. Most people went bankrupt. Speculation was a bad idea at the time. Nicholas Lowe, however, did things a little bit differently. Instead of just purchasing land and selling it to whomever, he purchased land and developed villages and then sold properties around the villages he owned, as opposed to everyone else who let the building of villages up to the people who bought the land and moved out there all by their lonesome. This was wildly successful for Nicholas Lowe. He had several places that he helped build, including the city of Watertown, right on the Canadian border. They're all in New York, by the way. The city of Lowville, which bears his name, and probably most famously the city of Ballston Spa, which is not too far from Saratoga. It was kind of an early retreat for Americans. Now Lake George has kind of taken its place, but an early getaway town, though many people live there full time, and Nicholas Lowe ends up spending the last several years of his life in Ballston Spa himself. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, do me a favor and hit like so that way more people can see the video and more people can learn about the American Revolution with us. If you're new here, hit subscribe. I put out videos about the American Revolution 7 days a week. And I'll be back with another founder for you tomorrow.